Alright, so I just watched a video by Ask Yourself called Retard Level Name the Trait Explanation, and perhaps I'm like sub-retard because it didn't make much sense to me. It seemed to be all about two cubes. So to give him the benefit of the doubt, I'm going to go and watch Name the Trait, his original video published on October the 6th, 2017, and see if that sheds any light on it. Like, I mean, I've come across this Name the Trait watching videos and stuff. I understand a little bit what it is, but I don't know if Ask Yourself like created or whatever, but I'm interested in what he has to say about it.
Can you think of a certain trait that they do or don't have that justifies us doing that to them?
I don't know, I think it's very strange.
I think if there is one,
I can't give you an answer. It's something I can't,
Okay.
I can't think about it.
I'm often asked for a video specifically on Name the Trait. So, today I've decided to deliver. Name the Trait is just a basic logical consistency test. It's designed to determine whether proposed justifications...
Is it a logical consistency test, or is it a trap?
...for animal exploitation produce contradiction within an individual's worldview. I'll explain the argument, then deal with a few common objections. The basic formula is as follows. The first segment determines whether animal moral value follows logically from your worldview. The second segment determines whether veganism follows logically from animal moral value. Before addressing this second component about what treatment a creature...
Okay, so already like we seem to be using a kind of like ambiguous term, at least to me, but like, yeah, I might be sub-retard here, but argument for animal moral value. And what exactly does the term moral value mean? So if we look on Google, it's talking about moral values being a set of principles, but what is moral value? So like, okay, what is moral value? Okay, so I can't find anything actually saying moral value. It's all about moral values, so I guess I'm going to have to make an assumption that what he's saying by moral value is he's saying of value. Okay, so like value as a being. Okay.
deserves based on their level of moral value. We need to establish whether assigning the creature moral value in the first place follows from an individual's worldview. The basic idea behind the first segment is that assuming humans have moral value is bootstrapping ethics for humans. Someone else can choose to bootstrap ethics for animals, and to reject their bootstrapping of animal ethics without simultaneously rejecting your own bootstrapping of human ethics, you need to use an argument that will only apply to animals in practice, but which in principle is consistent because it would work for humans if it were applicable to them.
So already, like, it seems that this is getting like extremely convoluted and complicated. Like, somebody wise once said something along the lines of like, the truth is simple, you know, and should be quite easy to communicate.
If you reject the argument once applied to humans, then within your worldview, that argument per se, meaning by itself, is not valid. So to deploy it will produce a contradiction, such as intelligence does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Social contract does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Species does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value, etc. I'll deal with the objection that someone can reject human moral value later, along with others, but...
Okay, I'm just like noticing here, I mean, he's talking about contradictions and stuff. It's not really, he's sort of laying the groundwork, I suppose. But what we'll have here is there is no trait absent in animals, which, if absent in humans, would cause us to deem ourselves valueless. And what interests me is this term here, valueless, because that's kind of black and white. It's very polarized. It's like it's a yes or no kind of thing. Why can't there be a spectrum, you know, like a bit of subtlety, like something being of more value than something else, not necessarily of value and valueless, you know? Therefore, without establishing the absence of such a trait in animals, we contradict ourselves by deeming animals valueless. They got valueless. Couldn't an animal be seen as of less value, or even seen of almost like equal value, but serving a different purpose? I don't think that like to farm and eat animals means that you see them as valueless. It's a little bit of a framing already. I don't know. I see a lot of this with like the vegan street debates and stuff. It's like an exercise in framing, basically putting the person into an ever smaller box until they have to give you the answer that you want to hear. Okay, I'll carry on, see where we'll go.
For now, let's assume we're talking to a normal human being who subjectively believes humans should have moral value. What exactly is it about animals that this person may use to justify denying animals moral value?
So, we're talking about this like moral value thing again. What? I'm just confused why the value part is so important.
Well, here are 23 common candidate traits and the contradictions they produce if you don't accept them per se as grounds for rejecting human moral value. Species does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Intelligence does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Inclusion in the social contract does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Ability to reciprocate morality does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Self-concept does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Future concept does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Science does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Philosophy does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value. Religion does and doesn't justify rejecting moral value, all the way down the list. Civilization, language, morality, philosophy of mind, tastiness, nutritiousness, art, appreciation for beauty, culture, bred to die, difference, species normality, emotional bias, circle of life. Unless you would accept the argument per se as grounds for rejecting human moral value, then logical consistency dictates the argument per se is invalid within your worldview. Once you've accepted...
I must admit you've lost me there.
...accepted that your worldview leads to animal moral value, the question becomes, what does this mean for practical ethics? How should you treat animals if they are beings of value? Well, once again, we can use the same tool of logical consistency to determine what mode of treatment is...
Here's the thing, man. Like, if this is really important to you, why can't you express it in a simple way that anyone can understand without all these, like, double negative things going on and ambiguous terms like moral value? I mean, I get, like, you know, like you're quite intelligent, but what use is that intelligence if you can't communicate to the average man, eh?
Is appropriate. If you hold the position that humans should not be murdered, raped, enslaved...
Oh, do you see that rape? That was Vlog-like's second law in action.
...etc., due to their moral value, then someone else can say that they believe animals should not be murdered, raped, enslaved, etc., due to their moral value. And to reject this, you'd have to use an argument that doesn't produce contradiction. Now, this...
Okay, I was going to take a moment to read this for myself. Okay, so argument for veganism from animal moral value. So this is like, I'm going to say argument for veganism from saying that an animal is of value. Okay, animals are of value. There is no trait absent in humans which, if absent in humans, hang on, there's no trait absent in animals which, if absent in humans, would cause us to consider anything short of non-exploitation to be an adequate expression of respect for human moral value. That is one fucking mighty sentence. Could you not have put it in like more simple terms? Again, this is like framing the whole thing about value. Like, purpose doesn't necessarily have to be in line with value.
Mode of reasoning can't exactly tell us what the perfect model for animal treatment is. This is because most of us would agree we don't currently have a perfect model for human treatment. So, as our notions of how to treat humans change, so will our notions of how to treat animals. For example, in a society where rape is condoned,
There we go with Vloglike's second law.
namethetrait would also condone rape for animals. Namethetrait is a logical algorithm for determining consistent treatment, not ideal treatment. Now, some people might at this point think that namethetrait is going to produce identical standards of treatment for humans and animals. That would indicate that they do not properly understand the argument. Morally consistent treatment does not mean identical treatment. Some differences of treatment can clearly be rationally justified as consistent. For most people, this isn't true of things like murder, rape, enslavement, etc., as I said above, but is very true of things like religious freedom, voting rights, etc. Here are some examples of treatment differences that don't produce inconsistency for most people. Animals do not deserve a right to vote because they can't conceptualize voting. Well, unless you think humans who can't conceptualize voting, like the profoundly retarded, need voting rights, you're perfectly consistent to deny animals voting rights. Animals do not deserve a right to religious freedom because they aren't sufficiently intelligent to conceptualize religion.
Again, like, why are we going off on this like really complicated tangent? If this I don't know what it is. This argument was a little bit more simple and a bit more concise. It would be self-evident, or you wouldn't have to explain it in such complicated ways.
Well, unless you believe that humans who can't conceptualize religion need a right to religious freedom, this denial of religious freedom to animals is fully consistent. I'd also point out that the notion that humans still deserve these rights, even if they can't exercise them, because once we start denying them, we create a gray area where some humans who deserve rights won't get them, isn't a logical problem here. That is a pragmatic argument. It doesn't actually mean that on a moral level, the denial of rights is wrong. For example, if we had a perfect sorting mechanism that got rid of the gray area, there would no longer be a moral issue with denying these rights to certain people. The issue arises purely from the pragmatic concern of incorrect sorting of people into the categories of deserving and not deserving rights.
You know, this is starting to remind me of Tony Blair, and Tony Blair's great trick was that he would just talk in these convoluted ways, using nice language and sounding like very intelligent. But no one ever really knew what the fuck he was going on about.
Anyway, that's the argument. If you accept human moral value, you can't reject animal moral value with an argument that is per se invalid within your worldview. And if you accept animal moral value, you can't argue for different standards of treatment with arguments that are per se invalid within your worldview. Now, let's deal with some common objections. Firstly, a common objection is that one can reject human moral value. This is completely true, and if you're willing to do this, it is consistent to reject animal moral value. Most sane people don't.
I'm probably missing out here because I still don't understand what the term moral value means.
Want to do this, however, for obvious reasons. And if someone tells you they deny human moral value, it's important to clarify that A, you aren't talking about human moral value in an ontologically objective sense. You're talking about a subjective belief in human moral value. This is important because many people mistake P1 of the first argument as an assertion of objective morality. And B, if you run the trait subjectively believed to lack moral value through namethetrait and it produces a contradiction, the worldview is inconsistent because it states a subjective belief that a being lacks moral value does and doesn't justify.
I'll tell you, man, I've actually had employment contracts that are more straightforward and easy to understand than this.
By murder. Another common objection is that morality does not need to be logical. This is, of course, also true. You don't have to be logical about morality. Namethetrait is not an argument for objective morality. It is a consistency testing algorithm. So unless the person accepts the trait does not need to be treated consistently, per se, then their worldview contains the contradiction. Logical inconsistency does and doesn't justify denial of moral value. Another objection is that namethetrait
Speak English, boy.
doesn't deal with strict contradictions because it finds an argument contradictory in the human context instead of the original animal context where it was deployed. This relies on a complete misunderstanding of what contradiction means. It doesn't matter if an idea is found to be contradictory within the original context that it was deployed. Once you find a single context where the idea is contradicted, the idea itself is now contradictory. So let's take a non-animal rights related example to avoid bias. If an alien biologist looks at a sample of humans and observes that adult humans are over 3 feet tall, his observation becomes contradictory the second another alien biologist finds a midget. The objection that his claim doesn't produce a contradiction
What the fuck are we talking about?
because it wasn't contradicted in the original context that it was deployed is functionally retarded. It doesn't matter where the exception to the rule comes from. Once we find the exception, the rule produces contradiction. Just as with justifications for murder, once you find an exception to the justification per se produces contradiction. A final objection is that namethetrait is not the most persuasive argument. I've never claimed.
Based on what I've seen so far, I wouldn't say that it isn't the most persuasive. I'd say it's the least clear argument because I don't really understand what the fuck you're on about.
That namethetrait is the most psychologically effective argument. It's a useful tool because, like it or not, logic comes up a lot in discussions of veganism, and it's important to understand. Even if you don't articulate it in its raw form, it's worth understanding logically why any given excuse for animal exploitation is or is not consistent. Okay, so there's a breakdown of namethetrait. Hopefully you found it helpful. It's a pretty basic tool, but I'm sure retards will be struggling with it for decades.
Right, I'm obviously retarded because I'm struggling with your explanation, definitely.
That's all for today. Till next time.
Alright, so the reason I watched this video is because I'm a little bit aware of namethetrait, and it's always kind of struck me as a kind of parlor game, like a little bit like giving somebody a paradox, like saying Pinocchio says, now my nose will grow, what happens, and then people kind of getting a bit stunned. I think it's more of that than it is a tool for shining light onto people's internal contradictions. I think also like maybe saying like retards will take decades to understand it is blaming your inability to communicate it or the actual like convoluted nature of it on the audience being retards, like maybe it would be a good idea if this is actually like a valid thing for you to make a video that's 2 minutes long, explaining in clear, plain English. Get rid of all those like double negatives and complex shit, and like tangents and all this kind of stuff. Just clear to the meat of it. Explain what name the trait is and why it's valid. Because all I'm kind of seeing at the moment is a rather elaborate parlor trick.